The morning my body finally gave up, the sky outside the hospital window was pale and colorless, like it had already decided not to care. I remember holding my stomach, feeling a sharp, relentless pain that refused to be ignored any longer. The doctor's words echoed in my head with cold certainty. Emergency surgery. No delays. No negotiations. What terrified me more than the operating room was not the thought of being cut open, but the thought of my twins. They were barely 2 years old, still at the age where they searched for me the moment I left the room. I was a single mother, worn thin by sleepless nights and endless responsibilities. Their father had disappeared long before they learned to speak, leaving behind silence and excuses. I did what any desperate child would do. Called my parents. I had always been the difficult one in the family. The one who made choices they didn't approve of. The one who married the wrong man, divorced too early, and came back home carrying 2 babies instead of pride. I already knew their tone before they even spoke. They refused. Not loudly. Not cruelly on the surface. Just calmly, as if they were declining an invitation to dinner. They said they were tired. They said they had plans. They said I should have thought about this earlier in life. They said my children were my responsibility. I hung up with my hands shaking, not from pain this time, but from something heavier settling in my chest. I stared at my twins sitting on the hospital bed, playing with the edge of the blanket, unaware that their world was about to be shaken. That was when I thought of Grandpa. He lived alone in a small, aging house at the edge of town. A quiet man everyone seemed to underestimate. He had lost Grandma years ago and since then spoke very little. My parents often said he was stubborn, old-fashioned, and irrelevant. They rarely visited him. I hesitated before calling. He was old. He walked slowly. He deserved peace, not chaos. But I had no one else. When he answered, his voice was steady, calm, and warm in a way I had forgotten existed. I didn't explain much. I didn't need to. He simply said he was on his way. He arrived at the hospital before the pain medication even kicked in. I watched him from the bed as he walked toward me. His back slightly bent. His hands rough from years of work. He looked at my twins, then at me, and nodded as if everything was already decided. He didn't ask why my parents refused. He didn't shake his head or sigh. He just took off his coat, sat beside the twins, and held their small hands like it was the most natural thing in the world. As they wheeled me toward the operating room, I caught one last glimpse of him sitting there, humming softly while my children leaned against him. That image stayed with me as the anesthesia pulled me into darkness. What I didn't know then was that while I was unconscious on the operating table, something else was awakening. Quiet, patient resolve. And a kind of revenge no one in my family would ever forget. When I woke up, the first thing I felt was emptiness. Not the physical kind, but the silence that follows a storm. My body was heavy, stitched together, aching in places I couldn't yet name. The ceiling lights blurred above me, and for a brief moment, fear returned. Then I heard it. A familiar humming, low and steady, like an old song remembered by the bones. Grandpa was sitting beside the bed. My twins were asleep on his chest, one on each side, their tiny fingers tangled in the fabric of his worn shirt. He hadn't moved. His eyes were tired but alert, as if he had been guarding something precious all night. The nurse told me the surgery had gone well. Complications avoided. Recovery would take time, but I would live. I nodded, grateful, relieved, and still overwhelmed. When she left, Grandpa leaned closer and told me everything was under control. His voice carried no drama, no complaint. Just certainty. That certainty didn't come from nowhere. Over the next few days, as I drifted in and out of sleep, I began to notice changes. Grandpa wasn't just watching my children. He was managing everything. Feeding them, bathing them, talking to doctors, signing forms. Even the nurses seemed surprised by him, whispering about how attentive and capable he was for a man his age. My parents, on the other hand, did not come. Not once. They sent a message instead. Short one. They said they hoped I was recovering well. They asked when I would be discharged. There was no question about the twins. No offer of help. Just distance wrapped in politeness. Grandpa read the message and quietly put my phone back on the table. His face didn't change, but something hardened behind his eyes. I thought that was the end of it. I thought he would simply take me home, help me recover, and life would slowly return to its familiar struggle. I didn't know that while sitting in that hospital room, Grandpa was remembering everything. He remembered how my parents had begged him for help decades ago when they were young and broke. He remembered the money he had quietly given them to buy their first house. He remembered watching my mother hand that house's keys with pride, never once mentioning where the help came from. He remembered how they stopped visiting when Grandma got sick. How they sent excuses instead of presents. How they learned to take without gratitude. And now, he remembered how they refused their own grandchildren. The day I was discharged, Grandpa drove us home in his old car. The twins laughed in the back seat, pointing at passing trees like the world had just been newly invented for them. Grandpa smiled, but his hands tightened on the steering wheel. That evening, after the twins fell asleep, he sat at the small kitchen table and pulled out a thick folder I had never seen before. Documents yellowed by time. Receipts, contracts, names that belonged to our family, written in careful ink. He didn't tell me what he was doing. He didn't need to. His silence carried intention. The next morning my parents finally showed up. They arrived smiling, speaking softly, acting concerned, as if absence could be erased by performance. They complimented Grandpa for stepping in, thanked him lightly, and spoke as if everything had gone according to plan. Grandpa listened. He offered them tea. He let them talk. And for the first time I realized something unsettling. He wasn't angry. He was preparing. Recovery forced me into stillness, and in that stillness, I began to see things I had ignored my entire life. Grandpa moved through the house like a quiet shadow, steady and deliberate. Every morning he woke before dawn, prepared breakfast for the twins, and sat with them as sunlight slowly filled the room. He spoke to them in a calm, measured voice, telling stories about places they had never seen and values that had almost disappeared from our family. My parents started visiting more often after that first appearance. Their concern arrived late, but suddenly felt urgent. They brought fruit, offered advice, and spoke loudly about family unity. They laughed too much, stayed too little, and always watched Grandpa when they thought no one noticed. Something had shifted. I noticed how Grandpa never corrected them, never confronted them, never raised his voice. He simply observed. His silence felt heavier than anger ever could. Sometimes, when the twins were playing on the floor, I would catch him looking at my parents with an expression I couldn't quite name. It wasn't resentment. It was clarity. One afternoon, while my parents were visiting, Grandpa took out the same old folder and placed it on the table. He didn't open it. He didn't explain it. He simply left it there, like a presence that demanded respect. My parents fell unusually quiet. Their smiles tightened. Their eyes followed that folder as if it might suddenly speak. After they left, I asked Grandpa what was inside. He told me it was history. He said people forget what they are given when it arrives quietly. They forget the hands that lift them when no one else is watching. They begin to believe their comfort is proof of their superiority. He said some lessons can only be taught when people feel safe enough to be careless. Days later, I overheard my parents arguing on the phone in the next room. They spoke in hushed voices, but fear has a way of leaking through walls. They mentioned property, papers. They said Grandpa was getting old and unpredictable. They said things needed to be secured before it was too late. That night, Grandpa asked me to sit with him after the twins fell asleep. The house was quiet, filled only with the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. He finally opened the folder. Inside were documents that told a story no one ever shared out loud. The house my parents lived in. The land it stood on. Even part of the business they proudly claimed as their own. All of it had started with Grandpa. Purchased in his name. Transferred with conditions that were never fulfilled. He had never taken credit. never demanded repayment. He believed family meant trust. Now he believed family meant responsibility. He told me he had already spoken to a lawyer. Not out of spite but out of necessity. He said the world had changed, and kindness without boundaries only feeds entitlement. He said he wouldn't punish but he would correct. The next day he invited my parents over for dinner. He cooked slowly, carefully, like someone preparing for a ceremony rather than a meal. The twins sat at the table laughing, unaware of the weight hanging in the air. After dinner, Grandpa finally spoke. He didn't accuse. He didn't shout. He spoke about legacy, about what it means to protect the vulnerable, about how true family shows up when it is inconvenient, not when it is easy. Then he placed the documents on the table. My parents went pale. He told them their refusal at the hospital had made something painfully clear. If they could abandon blood in a moment of need, they could not be trusted to guard what came next. He explained that everything he had once planned to leave to them would be redirected, not taken away in anger, but reassigned with purpose. He said my children would be protected. My future would be secured. My parents tried to speak, but words failed them. Excuses sounded hollow in a room filled with truth. That was the night I understood what Grandpa's revenge really was. It wasn't humiliation. It was accountability. After that night, nothing in our family felt the same, even though everything looked exactly as before. My parents still smiled when they visited, still asked polite questions, still pretended the ground beneath their feet wasn't cracking. But their voices had lost their confidence, and their eyes carried a constant calculation, as if every word they spoke might be weighed and used against them later. Grandpa, meanwhile, became even quieter. His presence no longer needed explanation. Decisions followed him naturally like gravity. He spent long hours with his lawyer, not in secret, but without announcement. Papers were signed. Names were changed. Futures were rearranged with the slow patience of a man who understood that real power never rushes. My recovery continued, and with each passing week, I grew stronger. But I also grew more aware. I saw how my parents suddenly volunteered to help with the twins, how they offered to babysit, cook meals, and drive us places. Their kindness arrived too late and carried a sharp edge of fear. It wasn't love that moved them now. It was loss. Grandpa never stopped them. He let them help. He let them try. But he never forgot. One afternoon my mother pulled me aside. Her voice trembled as she spoke about family mistakes, about misunderstandings, about how stress makes people say things they don't mean. She asked me to talk to Grandpa for them. She asked me to remind him that they were still his children. I listened without interrupting. Then I told her the truth. Grandpa hadn't stopped loving them. He had simply stopped protecting them from the consequences of their choices. She didn't respond. She just nodded, slowly realizing that there were no words left to bargain with. That evening, Grandpa took the twins out for a walk. I watched from the window as he held their hands. His pace slow but steady. People on the street smiled at them, unaware they were witnessing the center of our family shift in real time. When he returned, he looked tired, older than before. I realized then that his strength didn't come without cost. Carrying truth is heavier than carrying anger. He sat beside me and spoke about the future. He said he didn't have many years left, but what mattered wasn't time, it was direction. He said he wanted my children to grow up knowing safety, dignity, and love without conditions. He wanted me to heal without fear of falling back into dependence on people who had already proven unreliable. He told me everything had been arranged. A trust in the twins' names. A house secured for us. Education funds protected. None of it flashy. All of it solid. My parents arrived later that night, unannounced. They had heard rumors. They demanded clarity. Grandpa didn't raise his voice. He simply handed them copies of the finalized documents. The silence that followed was heavy and complete. They realized then that there was nothing left to negotiate. The choices they made in a hospital hallway had reached further than they ever imagined. As they left, my father paused at the door. For a moment, he looked less like a parent and more like a child facing the loss of approval he never thought could be taken away. Grandpa watched him go without satisfaction. Justice, when done right, doesn't need applause. Life did not suddenly become perfect after that. It became honest. And honesty, I learned, is far more demanding than comfort. My parents stopped visiting as often. When they did, their conversations stayed shallow, careful, as if afraid to disturb something sacred they no longer understood. They were polite. They were distant. They were no longer in control. The twins grew quickly, filling the house with laughter and noise. They followed Grandpa everywhere, copying his slow steps, sitting beside him as he worked in the garden or read in his chair. He taught them without lectures, through patience, through consistency, through showing up every single day. I returned to work months later, stronger than before, not just in body but in spirit. I no longer lived with the quiet fear of being abandoned when things went wrong. Grandpa had removed that fear at its root, not with promises, but with preparation. Time, however, is never generous. Grandpa's health began to fade slowly, like daylight slipping away without warning. He never complained. He never asked for sympathy. He simply continued, one careful step at a time, until one morning he didn't wake up. The house was unbearably quiet that day. At the funeral, my parents stood at a distance, unsure of where they belonged. There were no confrontations, no dramatic scenes. Just the weight of what had been lost and what had been chosen. The lawyer read Grandpa's final letter days later. It wasn't long. It didn't accuse. Didn't explain. It simply stated that love without responsibility is empty, and family without loyalty is fragile. He wrote that his decisions were not acts of revenge, but acts of protection. Everything he promised remained exactly as he arranged it. Years passed. My children grew into thoughtful, grounded souls. They knew their great-grandfather not as a man of revenge, but as a man of quiet courage. They knew his story because they lived inside its outcome. As for my parents, they aged too. Regret softened them in ways pride never could. They learned, too late, that refusing help in a moment of need can echo across generations. Sometimes late at night when the house is still, I think back to that hospital room. To the fear, to the pain, to the moment everyone else turned away. And I remember the sound of Grandpa's humming. That was the moment everything changed.